The focus of my research for this particular study was a protein called TDP-43, and it's kind of a newly discovered protein, at least in the context of Alzheimer's disease. We actually found that people who have clinical Alzheimer's disease, so they have dementia that we say is due to Alzheimer's disease, about 2/3 of those people actually had this protein, this abnormal protein, in their brain, along with the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease as we know it, the plaques and tangles that we call Alzheimer's. A number of researchers have been looking at this protein and discovered that it was present in the brain of a lot of people who had Alzheimer's disease when they came to autopsy. It's actually more common than we thought it was. People are just starting to look at it and stain for it when they're looking in the brain. So we found that half of the people in our study, and our people are about 80 years old on average, when they came to autopsy, half of them had this protein in their brain. And then if they had clinical Alzheimer's dementia when they died, that number was 2/3 that had this protein in their brain. Some of our previous research, a lot of the research that we do has shown that what we call Alzheimer's disease or clinical Alzheimer's disease, when you actually look in the brains of individuals who have clinical Alzheimer's disease, they don't just have those plaques and tangles that we talked about. They also have things like small strokes in their brain, another protein called Lewy bodies. So there's a kind of an accumulation of a number of different disease processes that work together to increase your chance of having Alzheimer's dementia. And this protein just seems to be another one of those diseases that may increase your chance of having Alzheimer's dementia. In terms of Alzheimer's pathology, plaques and tangles, we now have brain scans that we can do where we can put tracers in, and they're pretty cutting edge, and you can actually see the plaques and tangles in living people's brains on an image. They're not really ready for clinical diagnosis yet. It's mostly for research, but in the near future they will be. In terms of TDP-43, we don't have anything to see it in the brains of living people. At this point, it doesn't seem that we can do anything about Alzheimer's disease, even if you know that people have it. So what's interesting about this study is that it might open up another avenue of something else we can attack, another disease process that we could try to intervene on if we can't figure out how to intervene on the plaques and tangles. Actually, most research would indicate that if you start trying to intervene on the disease with people in their 80s or 90s, it's way too late. The disease process starts building over decades. So people in their 50s start to show Alzheimer's disease and these other pathologies that we talk about in their brain. And then it doesn't actually cause dementia until they're in their 70s and 80s. So the money, as we would say, if you really want to stop this disease, you have to intervene early. You have to intervene when people are in their middle ages, 40, 50, 60. Not quite clear yet. We don't know when TDP-43 starts building up in your brain. No one's actually characterized that yet. We know that Alzheimer's plaques and tangles start building up decades earlier, so there's no reason to believe that TDP-43 wouldn't be doing the same thing. It may be another protein that starts accumulating early in your brain that we could actually do something about in your middle age. This is definitely not on the radar screen just yet, and I don't think there's anything clinically we can do about this just yet. It's going to require a lot more work, but I think in the future, this could be something that we have a clinical intervention for. What we're finding is that the disease that we call Alzheimer's disease is really the accumulation of a number of processes. And we think that if you intervene on any one of those processes, it might have an effect. So you talked about traumatic brain injury. So it may be that if you have the proteins in your brain and you have a traumatic brain injury, it's those two things that lead to your dementia. So if you can alleviate the problems of the traumatic brain injury, then maybe the plaques and tangles in your brain won't ever lead to you getting dementia. A lot more work to be done, but I think the future that we all agree upon is intervening as early as possible. So identifying people who are at risk for developing dementia in their 80s and 90s and intervening as early as you possibly can. The future of my research is figuring out how this abnormal protein interacts with Alzheimer's disease proteins, pathologies, to bring about this construct of dementia, and figuring out how we can stop the process by attacking one or both or all of the processes involved.